Who gave you the right to keep a Moretti heir in a cage of lies for 5 years? The voice of Silas Moretti did not just break the silence of the small flower shop. It seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room. It was a voice that belonged to the soil of a graveyard, a low, vibrating rasp that had been seasoned by years of silence in a high-security cell in the icy winds of the Swiss Alps. Silas stood in the narrow doorway, his broad, heavy-set frame blocking the afternoon sun, casting a long, jagged shadow across the hexagonal floor tiles. He was dressed in a black wool overcoat that whispered of old money and cold vengeance. His presence was an anomaly in this place of soft petals and sweet fragrances. He was a wolf in a garden of lilies. Elena froze. The heavy iron pruning shears she was holding slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the small space. For a moment, her lungs refused to work. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that she was certain he could hear from across the room. She stared at the man she had once intended to marry, the man she had mourned with a grief so profound it had nearly hollowed her out. His face was leaner now, the skin pulled tight over high, aristocratic cheekbones. A jagged silver-white scar traced the edge of his temple. A permanent map of the night. The world believed he had burned to death in a prison transport fire. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed her. They were the slate gray of a stormy Atlantic, hardened by 1,800 days of isolation, betrayal, and a singular burning purpose. Beside her, sitting on a low wooden stool, was Julian. The 5-year-old boy was busy stripping the thorns from a bundle of stems, his small brow furrowed in concentration. As the silence stretched, Julian tilted his head and looked up. He didn't look at the stranger with the instinctive fear of a child. Instead, he studied Silas with a quiet, piercing intensity that was unsettlingly mature. Julian didn't have Elena's soft, rounded features or her warm brown eyes. He had the stubborn jawline, the straight, noble nose, and those unmistakable, haunting gray eyes that had been the mark of the Moretti bloodline for generations. "You were dead, Silas," Elena finally whispered. The words were thin, brittle things that felt like they might shatter in the air. Marcus. He took me to the morgue. He showed me the remains. He gave me the death certificate signed by the warden himself. I didn't keep him in lies. I kept him in the only world where he could breathe without a target on his back. I kept him away from the blood that ruined us. She moved instinctively, stepping between Silas and the boy, her hand reaching back to grip Julian's shoulder. It was a gesture of pure maternal defiance, a shield of flesh and bone against the monster that had returned from the grave. Silas took a slow, deliberate step forward. The soles of his polished leather shoes crunched on a stray carnation petal, a sound like breaking glass. He didn't look at Elena. His gaze was locked on the boy, his pupils dilating as the reality of what he was seeing finally began to pierce through his icy exterior. This wasn't just a child. This was a living, breathing testament to the life that had been stolen from him. "Safety?" Silas repeated. The words sounded like a curse in his mouth. "Safety is a luxury you don't get to negotiate when you carry my legacy, Elena. I spent 5 years in a concrete box, staring at a gray wall, wondering why the woman who swore to stay by my side vanished the moment the handcuffs snapped shut. I thought you had taken the settlement money and run to some island. I thought you had sold my location to the syndicate just to buy your freedom. I spent every night in that cell feeding on the thought of your betrayal. I never touched a cent of your money. Elena hissed, her fear suddenly turning into a sharp, jagged anger. Marcus told me the government had seized every offshore account. He told me the Moretti name was toxic, that if I stayed in the city, your rivals would tear the baby out of me just to ensure your line ended with you. I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back and the locket you gave me. I built this shop with my own blood and sweat, working 20-hour shifts so he could have a name that didn't start with a bullet. I didn't abandon you, Silas. I was a casualty of the war you started. Silas felt the first crack in the granite of his heart. He looked around the shop. It was humble, smelling of damp earth and sweet nectar, a far cry from the marble palaces and silk sheets he had once provided for her. He saw the calluses on Elena's hands, hands that used to be soft and pampered. He saw the way she lived in a state of constant, hyper-vigilant readiness, her eyes darting to the door every time a car passed. His suspicion, which had been a hot, pulsing thing for 5 years, began to shift. If Marcus had told her he was dead, and told him that she had disappeared with the money, then the betrayal wasn't just a coup for power. It was a psychological execution designed to leave them both alone and broken. Marcus, Silas's right-hand man, his brother in the organization, had played a master's game. Julian stood up from his stool, his small hand reaching out to tug on Elena's apron. "Mommy, why is the man from the mountain sad?" the boy asked. His voice was clear and remarkably steady. Silas knelt down, ignoring the sharp protest in his scarred joints. He was now eye level with the boy. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. It was like looking into a mirror that showed him a version of himself that hadn't been corrupted by the underworld. "Why do you call me that, Julian? The man from the mountains?" Julian didn't blink. He looked into Silas's gray eyes with a depth of understanding that was terrifying. "Mommy tells me stories before I go to sleep, about a king who had to go away to the great mountain to fight the dragons so the garden would stay green. She said the king had to stay in the cold for a long time, but one day he would find his way back by the scent of the lilies." Silas looked up at Elena, his expression a complex map of pain, guilt, and a sudden, overwhelming protectiveness. She had kept his memory alive as a hero, even while she believed he was ash. She had protected his image from the very reality of his crimes. The rage that had sustained him in prison evaporated, replaced by a cold, lethal focus directed at the man who had truly orchestrated this misery. "The dragons aren't gone, Julian," Silas said, his voice softening for the first time in 5 years, the gravelly edge giving way to a father's warmth. "But the king is back, and he's not going anywhere ever again." Elena shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "Silas, you can't be here. Marcus. He isn't just a boss now. He has the police, the judges, the mayor. They all eat from his hand. If he finds out Julian exists, if he finds out you're standing in the shop." "He already knows," Silas said, standing up and regaining his towering, predatory composure. "I visited Marcus last night. I didn't kill him. Not yet. I wanted him to feel the fear before I felt his blood. But I didn't know about the boy. I didn't know he had something this precious to use as leverage." The sound of a heavy black sedan screeching to a halt outside the shop cut through the air. The tires screamed on the asphalt, followed by the heavy thud of car doors slamming. Silas didn't hesitate. His reflexes, honed by years of surviving prison hits, took over. He grabbed Elena by the arm and pulled her toward the back exit. We're leaving. Now. This shop is compromised. If you want Julian to see the sun tomorrow, you have to trust the man you thought was dead. I don't have my things. Julian's medicine, the money I saved. None of it matters, Silas roared as the front window of the flower shop shattered inward. A hail of automatic gunfire shredded the buckets of lilies Julian had been working on, petals exploding in the air like snow. Silas shielded them with his own body, pulling a customized handgun from a holster concealed under his coat and firing 3 precise, lethal shots through the broken window. They scrambled into the back of a nondescript armored SUV parked in the narrow alley. As the driver sped away, Silas looked back. The small flower shop was already beginning to glow with the flickering orange light of an incendiary device. Everything Elena had worked for was burning to the ground. Julian sat between them, watching the retreating flames with those stormy eyes. He was a Moretti, born in the fire, shaped by the shadow. "Where are we going?" Elena asked, her voice trembling as she clutched Julian to her chest. "To the estate," Silas replied, sliding the silver signet ring, the symbol of the Moretti leadership, onto his finger. "To the place where this all started. I'm going to reclaim my house, Elena, and then I'm going to burn Marcus's world until there's nothing left but the truth." The return of the boss was no longer a whisper in the shadows. By tomorrow, the entire city would know that Silas Moretti had risen from the grave. And he wasn't alone. The iron gates of the Moretti estate didn't just open. They groaned, a heavy, metallic protest that echoed through the silent hills, like the waking of an ancient beast. Silas stood on the gravel driveway, the cool night air filling his lungs, carrying the scent of pine and the faint, bitter tang of expensive gunpowder. Behind him, the armored SUV remained idling, its engine a low, predatory hum. To his left, Elena gripped Julian's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white, her eyes darting between the armed men lining the grand stone staircase. There were 8 of them. These weren't the old guard, the men Silas had grown up with. Men who understood the difference between a boss and a tyrant. These were Marcus's recruits, younger, hungrier, and dressed in tactical gear that looked more like a private militia than a family detail. Their weapons were leveled, the red laser dots dancing across Silas's chest like blood-red fireflies. "I will not say it again," Silas roared, his voice cutting through the tension with the force of a physical blow. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, his chin tilted up, the silver signet ring on his finger glinting under the harsh security floodlights. "I am Silas Moretti. I built these walls. I paid for the dirt you're standing on. If you want to die for a man who won't even remember your names by morning, step aside. But if you want to live to see the sun, step aside." The lead guard hesitated. He looked into Silas's eyes, those slate-grayed depths that held 5 years of accumulated darkness, and he saw the ghost of a king. Slowly, the muzzle of his rifle dipped. The psychological weight of the Moretti name was a weapon Silas hadn't lost in prison. "Smart choice," Silas muttered. He ushered Elena and Julian inside. The interior of the house was a visual assault. Where there used to be understated elegance, Marcus had installed gaudy gold leaf and velvet drapes. It was a house in mourning, draped in the clothes of a celebration. "What has he done to this place?" Elena whispered. "He's tried to bury the memory of us under a layer of gold," Silas said. "But gold is soft. It doesn't hold up in a fire." They reached the library, Silas's inner sanctum. The doors were reinforced steel, masked by mahogany. Silas leaned into the retinal scanner. A thin red line of light traced his iris. For a heartbeat, the system whirred, searching for a dead man's data. Then with a heavy, satisfying thunk, the bolts retracted. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and Silas's father's cigars. "Julian, come here," Silas said, sitting in the high-backed leather chair. He reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a small wooden carving of a wolf. "My father gave this to me when I was 5. He told me that a wolf is only as strong as his pack. I thought my pack had abandoned me. I was wrong." Julian took the wolf, his small fingers tracing the wood. Silas then turned his attention to the computer console. This was the secondary server, a shadow system Marcus hadn't discovered. As Silas typed in the overrides, the screens flickered to life, displaying 5 years of intercepted communications. "Elena, look at this," Silas commanded. He pulled up a file dated 3 months after his arrest. The screen showed a video of a sterile white room. It was the private clinic Marcus had mentioned. Elena was in the frame, sitting on a bed, looking broken. Marcus was standing over her. "The doctors say Silas didn't suffer." Marcus's voice came through the speakers, oily and false. "The fire was quick. You need to disappear, Elena. It's what Silas would have wanted." Elena's hands flew to her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. "He stood there and watched me cry for weeks. He told me he was the only friend I had left." But the real twist lay deeper. Silas scrolled further, finding a contract hidden in the deep encryption layer. It was a deal between Marcus and the head of the rival Valenti family. "He sold the route," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a murderous clarity. "The night I was arrested, the police didn't just find us. Marcus gave them the coordinates of the meeting in exchange for the Valenti family staying out of his way while he took my chair. It wasn't a raid. It was a sale. He traded my life for a crown he didn't even know how to wear." Suddenly, the library doors vibrated with the force of a heavy blow. A muffled voice shouted from the other side, "Silas, I know you're in there." Marcus's voice was high-pitched and desperate. "You're a ghost. Open the door and maybe I'll let the girl and the brat walk away." Julian flinched. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his gun drawn. He looked at Elena, seeing the paralyzing terror in her eyes. "The panic room," Silas said, gesturing to the bookshelf. "Get inside. Now. Do not come out until you hear the sequence. 3 taps, a pause, and then 2. Do you understand?" As the hidden door hissed shut, Silas felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of his guilt distilled into a single objective. He walked to the library door and pressed the release. The door swung open. Marcus stood there, flanked by 4 men, wearing a gold-threaded suit that looked like a costume. "You're in my chair, Marcus," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "You're living in a house built on my blood, and you've been lying to a woman I would burn the world for." "I did what I had to do," Marcus shouted. "The Valentis were going to wipe us out. I saved the organization." Silas moved through the estate like a phantom. He knew every creak of the floorboards. He reached the balcony overlooking the foyer and looked down. The Valenti soldiers were pouring in, trampling the gold leaf floors. He felt a flare of cold rage. They were desecrating his father's house. But more importantly, they were threatening the path Elena and Julian were taking through the tunnels. He needed to buy them 10 more minutes. He tossed a flashbang grenade into the foyer. The white-hot burst of light sent the men staggering. Silas descended the back stairs, reaching the basement where Marcus was still screaming in the cold storage. Silas didn't open the door. He leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "Listen to me, Marcus," Silas shouted over the gunfire. "The Valentis are here. They know you're a liability. If they find you, they'll put you in the ground." "Silas, let me out." Marcus's voice was a shiver of pure terror. "You already gave me everything I needed, Marcus," Silas said. His voice dropped to a low whisper. "You gave me the reason to fight, and you gave me the reason to let it all go." Silas reached for the master gas valve and twisted it, flooding the basement with natural gas. He set the furnace timer to trigger a spark in 5 minutes. "Goodbye, Marcus. Think of it as a transport fire. Only this time, the ghost is real." Silas sprinted for the tunnel entrance behind the wine crates. The sounds of the soldiers were echoing in the stairwell. He slipped into the dark, narrow passage, his body screaming in protest. Every muscle in his legs felt torn. His hands scraped against the stone, drawing blood, but he didn't stop. He reached the end of the tunnel, pushing open the iron grate that led into the boathouse. Through the slats, he saw the dark silhouette of the submersible disappearing beneath the surface of the black water. They were out. They were safe. But the Valenti SUVs were already circling the lake. Silas stood on the edge of the dock, a dark, immovable shadow. He pulled the remote detonator from his pocket and looked back at the grand estate on the hill. "The garden is safe," he whispered. He pressed the button. The explosion was a symphony of fire. The entire north wing lifted into the air in a ball of orange flame. The gas in the basement ignited seconds later, creating a secondary blast that leveled the grand foyer. The shockwave hit Silas with the force of a tidal wave, throwing him backward into the icy midnight water of the lake. As he sank into the darkness, the world became a muffled hum. He felt the cold embracing him. For a moment, he thought of staying there. The war was over. His family was safe. But then he saw Julian's face. He saw those gray, stormy eyes. "Don't go to the mountain again, Daddy." Silas kicked. He fought the current, his lungs burning. He broke the surface 50 yards away, gasping for air that tasted of smoke. He swam toward the opposite shore, toward the dense woods where Victor would be waiting. He dragged himself onto the muddy bank, his clothes heavy and beginning to freeze. He didn't look back at the fire. He walked into the trees, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun would eventually rise. 2 hours later, in a small clearing, a green truck sat idling. Elena stood by the door, her hands shaking as she clutched Julian. When Silas emerged from the bushes, soot-covered and shivering, she let out a half-sob, half-scream. Julian broke away, running toward Silas. The man collapsed to his knees as the boy collided with him. "You're back," Julian whispered. "You killed the dragons." Silas held the boy so tightly, it was as if he were trying to fuse their souls. He looked up at Elena, who was standing over them with a new terrifying hope. "The dragons are dead," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "But the king is tired, Julian. He's very, very tired. Then we go to the mountain, Julian said, placing the wooden wolf in Silas's hand. The pack is whole now. Silas looked at the carving, then at Elena. The Empire was ash, but for the first time, he had won the only war that mattered. The silence of the northern mountains was not the empty silence of a prison cell. It was a living, breathing thing, filled with the whisper of wind through ancient pines and the rhythmic crack of Silas's axe against cedar. For Silas Moretti, the transition from a man who ruled by the bullet to a man who lived by the blade of a wood splitter was a slow, agonizing exorcism. In the city, every shadow had been an assassin. Here, the only judgment came from the towering peaks. For the first 6 months, Silas didn't sleep. He would wake in the dead of night, hand clawing for a weapon that wasn't there. He would walk the perimeter in the freezing moonlight, looking for footprints in the snow. But Elena was always there, watching him from the porch. "He doesn't see a monster, Silas," Elena said one evening as the sky turned a bruised purple. "He just sees his father, the man who came back from the mountain. I look at him, Elena, and I see the Moretti curse." Silas replied, his gaze fixed on Julian, who was playing nearby. "What if the world comes for him because of what I did?" "Then we teach the boy to be stronger than the name," Elena replied, her hand finding his. "Silas Moretti is dead. Only Silas the woodsman remains. But the world has a way of finding what it needs." 8 months in, Victor arrived one last time. He brought a photo of the ruined flower shop. In the center of the debris, someone had placed a fresh white lily. A new group, the architects, wanted the Moretti ledger, a digital ghost Silas had already destroyed. They had sent a faceless assassin known as the Wraith to finish the bloodline. Silas didn't run. He sent Elena and Julian to the hidden cellar and stepped out into a massive snowstorm to face the last dragon. The fight was primal and silent. Silas didn't use a gun. He used the strength he had built in the mountains. He pinned the assassin to a tree, not to kill him, but to send a message. "Go back," Silas growled into the Wraith's ear. "Tell your masters I have nothing left but a memory and an axe. But if a single shadow touches this mountain again, I will come down and burn your world until there isn't a single name left. I am the man who came back from the dead. Do they really want to see what I'm capable of when I have something to lose?" The assassin vanished into the storm. Silas returned to the cabin, tapped the secret sequence on the floorboards, and pulled his family into his arms. The year of the wolf was over. 10 years later, Silas stood on that same porch, watching a 16-year-old Julian prepare to leave for the city. Not to claim a throne, but to study law and bring justice to the streets his father once ruled. Silas handed him the silver signet ring, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder. "Use it to remember the scent of the lilies, son," Silas said. "And remember that a king is only as good as the peace he leaves behind." As Julian drove away, Silas felt the infinite, beautiful light of a second chance. Redemption is not the absence of the past. It is the courage to build a future on top of the ruins. If Silas and Julian's journey through the shadows into the light of the mountains moved you, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with those who need to learn that the greatest power a man can have is the power to protect those he loves. Type legacy in the comments if you believe everyone deserves a second chance. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.